recorded ramblings. Let's go. Alright, how to invent the airplane, part 2, according to Peter. Alright, so this one, no stars, but I did find this anecdote interesting. It said, years later, a hardware dealer in the neighborhood, Frank Hamburger, recalled how, at the time of the flood, he had been struggling to get started in his new business. Much of his stock consisted of nails stored in great quantity in the cellar and would have been ruined had the high water struck. This was during a flood in Dayton, Ohio. When the Wright brothers heard of his troubles, he said they came immediately, pulled off their coats, and helped carry the kegs of nails out of the cellar without seeking or accepting remuneration. So what does that have to do with inventing the airplane? Well, I propose you need to basically come from good stock to do something like inventing the airplane. You can't infight, you can't backstab, you have to be focused on the mission, and to do that you need to demonstrate that you care about the greater good and put the mission ahead of yourselves. And I underline that anecdote because I felt like, yeah, if these guys are able to stop what they're doing, help someone out, don't ask for favor, don't put it on social media, not virtue signal, that says a lot. It tells me they have the type of personality which would allow them to build the airplane and do something great. Those types of anecdotes, you know, from a historical standpoint are interesting, but I think they're very telling on, yeah, these people can invent the airplane because they're not gonna let petty disputes and their egos get in the way, which I thought was cool. So another thing that I thought was cool, incredibly cool actually. So what you have to understand about the Wright brothers, and you have to remember this one thing or nothing that follows will seem wondrous. Shout out, Muppets Christmas Carol. The Wright brothers had no college education, no formal technical training, no experience working with anyone other than themselves, no friends in high places, no financial backers, no government subsidies, and had little money of their own. There was no real reason they should be able to do this, but they did think that they could. Given their background was very limited, Wilbur sat down and he wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And in this letter, there are so many hot takes, okay? So I love that Wilbur wrote this letter for a number of reasons, and I'll just use what McCullough pulled out. But in this letter that he decided to write, Wilbur goes, "My observations since have only conceived me more firmly that human flight is possible and practical." Now this warranted 2 stars. He doesn't need any background training, doesn't need anything. He's just observing and he's believing and he's encouraged that he can create a flying machine with his own observation. That's all he needs. It's just important to trust your own observations and to make observations and to think, kind of circling back to chapter 1, and it's clear that Wilbur did that and he wrote it in his letter. The other thing I like about this letter that proves to me he has what it takes to create an airplane despite his lack of formal training is that he calls his own shot. He has confidence. In this excerpt from the letter he says, "I'm about to begin a systematic study of the subject in preparation for practical work to which I expect to devote what time I can spare from my regular business. I wish to obtain such papers as the Smithsonian Institute has published on the subject and if possible a list of other works in print in the English language." So there are so many things here. He's calling his shot. He's going to do a systematic study. You cannot do anything significant without putting in a serious amount of effort, okay? And you have to know that up front. There are no shortcuts. If you read the book, all of the anecdotes of people who tried to solve flight basically took shortcuts. But he's saying right here, it's going to be a systematic study, okay? In preparation for practical work. We'll get to this later, but yes, you have to put in practical work. You can't just do things in theory. It's not a thought economy in the late 19th century, early 20th century, okay? It's a practical economy, and you have to do things and you have to learn how to do them, you know, once you've put in the studying part. And so those 2 things were pretty incredible. And I guess something that stood out to me later is that the Assistant Secretary of the Smithsonian, Richard Rathbun, he responded. He sent them everything he had. You know, he took these guys seriously. He said, "Sure, I'll give you all the information you need. You know, there's no Google, so I will give you all the pamphlets on aviation." And they started studying in earnest. And this reminds me of a part, so I read 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel and Blake Masters. You know, quick tangent alert. He talks about a story. He says, "Bold plans were not reserved just for political leaders or government scientists. In the late 1940s, a Californian named John Reber set out to reinvent the physical geography of the whole San Francisco Bay Area. Even though he had no personal authority, people took the Reber plan seriously. It was endorsed by the newspaper editorial boards across California. The US Congress held hearings on its feasibility, yada, yada, yada." But then Thiel asks a really good question. But would anybody today, you know, 2000s, take such a vision seriously in the first place? In the 1950s, people welcomed big plans and asked whether they would work. Today, a grand plan coming from a school teacher would be dismissed as crankery. Yeah, 100% that's true, okay? Nobody writes letters, and if you did write a letter and you don't have the right, you know, background, you just get ignored. And if that happened to the Wright brothers, who knows how long it would take for the airplane to exist. So I love that they wrote the letter. I love that they called their shot. And I love that the Smithsonian was like, yeah, we encourage this, you know, go build it. Go, you know, make America great. I think that's awesome. So yeah, write letters, you know, be bold. Shout out painting guy, Bob Ross. What else do we have here? Okay, this was funny. So again, we just talked about, you know, today we live in a thought economy. This was a producer economy, right? A practical economy. You build things. McCullough calls out that in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the times were alive with invention, 2 stars, technical innovations, new ideas of every kind. George Eastman had introduced the Kodak box camera. Isaac Merritt Singer, the first electric sewing machine. The Otis Company had installed the world's first elevator in New York office buildings. Shout out Otis. I guess that's why all elevators are named Otis. I didn't know that. The first safety razor, the first mousetrap, the first motor cars built in America. All of this was happening when the Wright brothers were alive. So like, that's pretty cool. It's hard to say that now. There's a guy online, like a technologist, who basically pointed out that all of the technology that we've been using was invented like 15 years ago or more. Google, Facebook. There has been nothing new, you know, and the Wright brothers are coming of age in a time where people are inventing huge things that are new, and it's hardware. You know, when you're surrounded by invention, I think invention begets invention, and so that's pretty cool. I also think it's funny that they're from Ohio, and they did like 99.9% of their work in Ohio, but North Carolina threw up the first in flight license plate, and I, for a long time, basically till I read this book, kind of thought North Carolina was where the Wright brothers were from. Shame on me, but I didn't know. So here you go. They're from Dayton. They're from Ohio. Technically, they had their first flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, but they did all their work in Ohio, and that's where they had their bike shop. So shout out Dayton, Ohio. McCullough actually calls out, Dayton ranked first in the country relative to population in the creation of new patents. So there was just this atmosphere of inventing, and I think that helped a lot, and I would love for the United States to always be seen that way. Personally, I mean, I think that's how you do great things. So they were good people. They grew up in a time where invention was encouraged. The government encouraged them and did everything that they could to help them, and they knew that they needed to take a systematic study and then a practical approach at it. And this is no stars, but I don't know whoever's watching and if this ever happens to you, but sometimes you get an idea in your head. Maybe it's making a YouTube video, maybe it's writing a sci-fi book, maybe it's doing programming, or you just get an idea in your head and it just takes over. The way McCullough talks about their dream, he says, for Wilbur and Orville, the dream had taken hold. The works of Lilienthal and Moliard, the brothers would attest, had, quote, infected us with their own unquenchable enthusiasm and transformed idle curiosity into an active zeal of workers. End quote. So yeah, I mean, it just happens, and you just get this feeling and you get this idea festering in your head, and you just can't stop working on it until you get it solved, because you know it's right there. And the Wright brothers had that. So, you know, you're not going to invent the airplane and put in all this work, as you'll see, a lot of work, unless you have that idea, just that unquenchable need to get it done. Another thing the Wright brothers just inherently understood, quote, the chief need was skill rather than machinery. It was impossible to fly without both knowledge and skill. Of this Wilbur was already certain, and skill came only from experience in the air. He calculated that in the 5 years Lilienthal had devoted to gliders and gliding, he spent a total of only 5 hours in actual flight. It was hardly enough, and not how he and Orville would proceed. Yes, you have to do the thing, and you have to put in the work, and you have to get experience. If you want to make more money and get hired somewhere, they want to hire somebody who knows how to do something. They don't want to hire somebody who is going to trial and error 40 hours a week and gain the experience that they eventually want you to have. If they're hiring someone with experience, they want you to have already done that. The Wright brothers knew you got to get in the air, you got to risk your life, you have to gain experience. Only with experience will you be able to build this and understand how to do it. And then once you build it and have the experience, you can dumb it down. But there's no replacement for experience. There just isn't. And the fact that the Wright brothers knew this, and they bring it up repeatedly, and they point out that no one else before them who was interested in flight realized that, that's how you invent the airplane. That's how you do anything. You get experience doing it. That's basically, you know, it's as simple as that. All right. So, touched upon North Carolina. How does North Carolina come into play? Wind was the essential. The brothers had already come to appreciate, and clearly, if ever they were to succeed with what they had set their minds to, they must learn from experience, the ways of the wind. In answer to another inquiry, Wilbur sent to the United States Weather Bureau in Washington about prevailing winds around the country. They were provided extensive records of monthly wind velocities at more than 100 Weather Bureau stations, enough for them to take particular interest mattress in a remote spot on the Outer Banks of North Carolina called Kitty Hawk. So once again, they sent another letter. They asked the government answered. To be certain Kitty Hawk was the right choice, Wilbur wrote to the head of the Weather Bureau station there, who answered reassuringly about the steady winds and the sand beaches. Still further encouragement came when on August 18th, 1900, the former postmaster at Kitty Hawk, William J. Tate, sent a letter that said, yada yada yada, I underline this, I will take pleasure in doing all I can for your convenience and success and pleasure, and I assure you, you will find a hospitable people when you come among us. You know, so I love this. You're writing to the Weather Bureau, you're writing to the Kitty Hawk Weather Bureau station, you're hearing from the local residents of this remote place, and they're just like, come, just do it. So you have this awesome atmosphere of invention and encouragement and just support, and yes, that will help you invent the airplane. So that's chapter 2. We'll do part 3 a little bit later. Here's the first way you would... Suck at this, Kelsey. Why am I overthinking it so much? How do I do this? Recorded ramblings, let's go.